Hello and welcome to this ICME Safety Centre webinar on incident investigation and avoiding common pitfalls. My apologies. My name's Trish Kerrin and I'm the Director of the ICME Safety Centre. Joining me today I have David Ramsey, the Group Managing Director and President of Kelvin TOPSET, and David will be presenting the webinar for us today. This webinar will consist of David discussing incident investigation. The ICME Safety Centre webinars have been developed as a tool to share knowledge and information amongst our members. So what I would like to do now is hand over to David so that he can actually go through his presentation. I'll just pass over to him and very shortly he will actually show you his screen as we run through the presentation. Over to you now, David.
Okay. Hold on. Okay, is my screen visible?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Whatever time zone you happen to be in, pleased to be able to join me. What I propose to do this morning is to use 26 slides to accompany what I'm saying. The slides don't have a great deal of detail on them. It's not our style. It's they're really there as prompts for me as I'm talking to you. What I'm going to talk to you about is based on around 13 years or so of investigation, but I don't want you to think of investigation as just about safety. In fact, it's much wider than that. It covers things like process engineering and quality control. In fact, that's what I started out very many years ago, was being head of quality in a canning company in the food industry. So a lot of the things that apply there, just as equally, they would apply to what we call incident investigation. I'm just having trouble advancing my slide here. Let me just see if I can. Apologies about that, but let's see. Yeah. There we go. So really, this is, if you haven't seen me before, this is me. I don't normally smoke a pipe, but really for the benefits of the kind of Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts, this is me. But this is really where the investigation can actually go wrong, is right at the very beginning. And it is, and I have a couple of slides on this, it is about defining the problem. What is the problem? Essentially what we're looking at is based on systems thinking. And in any systems analysis or systems problem solving, the very first thing you do is defining the problem. And I'll probably refer a couple of times to front-end engineering. I know that my friend and colleague Chris is probably listening to me here, and he really was the person who introduced the front-end engineering to us. It's exactly the same thing. In anything you do in life, if you don't in fact decide what you're going to do and define that in advance, it will go wrong. And I've seen this happen, so many times in the past. You'll see here on your screen now Deepwater Horizon. I, in fact, led a team for Transocean to look at Deepwater Horizon. Clearly, it was a major event. And when I went out to America with an initially small team, but obviously that team grew to be very large, and we were there for about 6 months, working on this, that right at the very beginning, defining the problem was very important, because the actual team leader for the company, right at the beginning, said to me, David, thank you very much, because I wasn't sure what it was I was investigating. So here we've got a major disaster, and what is it you're looking at? Is it in fact an explosion? Is it the loss of a ship? Technically, it is a ship. Are we looking at pollution, loss of life, and so on? In fact, a very simple definition at the beginning was extremely important, because we defined the problem as what I thought it was at the time, which was clearly an explosion, and the trigger for that was ignition of hydrocarbons. We went and further analysed all that before we actually went into investigation. Then we formed the team and what we were doing. When we start any investigation, almost always starts with a telephone call. In fact, this week alone, we've had 2 telephone calls for 2 investigations that we're going to have to do. Both of these are in the North Sea, and right at the beginning, you've got this telephone call and you're trying to define what the problem is on the phone. Very rarely do you get, in my experience, very rarely do we get investigation starting from an email or somebody walking into your office and talking to you. So you've really got to try to work out in detail the incident statement, what you're going to do. In fact, going back to the Macondo incident, I was on my way to the pub at the time when I was phoned in the middle of the village street. So the first thing we're doing, we're trying to say, well, what is the event we're looking at? So that's actually very easy in this sense. If you think of it, this is a newspaper headline, this is the event that... so let's take an example here. And the one I quite often use, although I'm showing a chemical plant here, is in fact the Titanic. Because to say at the very simplest level, you know, what was the event? Well, clearly the ship sank. And then what was the trigger for that? Well, the trigger for that was it hit an iceberg. And you can do exactly the same thing for something like the Macondo, where, as I said a few minutes ago, what happened was that we had a major explosion to be further analysed, and the trigger for that was, in fact, ignition of hydrocarbons, as far as we could see at that time. Clearly, it's possible to go back over that at a later point and change that definition if you feel the parts of it weren't correct. But I'd have to say to you, in all the many years I and my colleagues have been doing this, it's very rarely that we've had to go back and change that initial definition. Certainly the event is the event, that's what happened. We often call the consequences, the event would be the consequences. We're going to analyse those, and we're going to analyse what happened to create those consequences. But another way of looking at it is what you see on the screen just now, the trigger and the event. And I do want to emphasise, as we're talking about the pitfalls of an investigation, by not getting this bit right, then it all goes wrong. I went along to a major client out in America, and they asked me to come and look at a problem they had. They'd had a problem, a rig very close to sinking, and they couldn't get the root cause analysis to work out. And I went through and I said, just give me a cup of coffee and I'll look at it, don't tell me anything. So I went through their analysis, and quite simply, the thing that was wrong, they hadn't got that initial definition right. Once we got the definition right, the whole thing fell into place. So pitfall number one is really getting started. If you don't get this right with the telephone call and defining your problem, then it's certainly going to go wrong. We had a major one we looked at a long time ago, which was a massive engineering project, which at that time cost around 500 million British pounds. And this project was a complete and total failure. And quite simply, it's because they did not define the problem at the beginning. For confidentiality reasons, I won't tell you which industry, because you may work it out. But in fact, this will never ever operate. And it was simply because the problem wasn't defined and it wasn't understood. We then go on to say the next point is we need to plan. We have two aspects of planning. And the first one is, in fact, about getting there, about forming a team. And again, if you don't do this right, things are going to go badly wrong. The first one is forming a team. You may not have the choice of that. That may be defined for you. It's very important that you get the team that you require. Do you need a technical specialist? Do you need somebody who's good at interviewing? How many people do you need? And clearly I can't define that for you here just now. But once you've done that, you then delegate the duties. Interestingly, I know that Trish is listening to this. One of the best ones I've ever seen, but that was led by an Australian guy on a fatal accident we were looking at in the explosives industry. He was very good at delegating and keeping to time and such like. Clearly you'll have to discuss deadlines because you haven't got unlimited time, and you can run out of time quite easily. Finding a place to work is really important. Again, here's another major pitfall. Where are you going to work? Get a room that you can lock. For two reasons. One, from a security point of view, so that people don't get into the room when they shouldn't be in the room. But the other one is quite a silly one that perhaps you wouldn't naturally think about, is to stop the cleaner coming in at night and they're cleaning up all your papers. And it has happened to me. Major pitfall. You come back in the morning and all your hard work is in the dustbin. And then clearly part of that is thinking about security, what you can tell people, what you can't tell people, and such like, and ensuring again that that room is locked. And then, strangely enough, make travel arrangements, because if you can't get there, you can't do the investigation. I was trained in air crash investigation, and one of the first things that you do is that you arrange the hotels. I did the same with my condo, because the press get there, and suddenly you can't get there because all the rooms are taken up by the press. So you've got to make travel arrangements, get your hotel, can you get there, and read the terms of reference or the scope. Some companies don't know what a scope is or a terms of reference, and you may have to write that. So if you don't have a terms of reference or a scope, it's very difficult to do the investigation. The next point where you can go wrong is the second part of planning, and that is actually planning the investigation itself with your team, who's going to do what, and in what areas will you be working. The thing is to try to define the areas that, are you going to have some people interviewing? For example, I did out in Las Palmas at one point, we were doing work on a rig, looked like a fatality, fortunately turned out not to be in the end, but my client, a guy I like, I'm very friendly with, we do quite a bit of drinking together when I'm with him, he said, David, I'm not going to the lead interview, and I thought, yeah, you're absolutely right, because he wasn't suited to doing that. The person who got really excited and started to get a bit angry. So you've got to choose that team and what you're going to look at. What bits are you going to look at? Now, one of the difficulties, of course, that we all have natural biases, be included. So by using some means, and we tend to use these charts and cards that we have to stop you going down the road. I've seen it before. It's a 46, it's a 92, whatever happened last year. It may be different, so you've got to consider that when you're planning what you're going to do, who's going to do what are the deadlines, and when will the report by. The next one is a major one here is change. We cannot have an incident without change being a factor in this. And it's logical if you think about it. Everything's running along absolutely perfectly until something is different, something changes. Now, I had a situation in a major refinery in Europe where there was a structural failure, and in fact the chief engineer was blocking the investigation all of the time, and it got moderately aggressive in that he would not accept that there was change. Clearly, there has to be change in some way or other, or the thing will be running along perfectly. So right at the very beginning, if you can't identify change, then I think there's a bit of a problem there. To go through every aspect of the areas that you're thinking about, using a planning chart such as we've got, and asking the question, change at each stage, identifying what that might be. And that helps enormously in doing investigations. So do remember that we're always looking for change. By not finding change, then you've got a major pitfall there. And I actually got this picture off the internet. It's not one that I took, and I'm suspecting there's a loading problem was the change here. Got an amusing picture. Then we go on to the next area, which is really a difficult one for me personally. Evidence is very important. We have to gather the evidence. I've got a couple of slides on this here, and it's getting the detail and getting all of the background supporting information, and we'll see that again on the next slide here where we've coded this up. I'm not a detailer, so I need to have somebody else who can gather the information. I remember doing a major railway investigation. There had been a train crash, and because railways are the oldest form of mechanised transport, the rules and regulations are enormous. And we had one side of a room filled with regulations, and very, very difficult. You have to have somebody who's part of your team who can reference all of that. Because if you have to go to court, or if you have to prove something from a legal point of view, then you have to have the evidence. This is one here which we used on the Macondo incident, but also is based on stuff that the Dutch Accident Investigation Board used. And you can see the sort of coding on this. First of all, top left, you've got the time. What was the time and the date and such like. Then you categorize what you're doing, technology, and then just the ticket number, the identification that you've got. At the bottom, you've got your evidence reference. I know that when we started Macondo, I think there were a million items of evidence to start with, and I don't think I'm exaggerating that from memory. Obviously, it's 17 years ago now. So then we have a colour coding. And the coding we used was pink. We're not quite sure. We haven't proved it yet. You'll notice to the right of that, there's one with green. We know that green is a proven. We've got the evidence for that. And then we've got the narrative in the middle there, telling us what it was that this particular ticket was about. Now, we had, hundreds, if not thousands, of these. But it's extremely important that you've got that evidence. And I do want to emphasise that, again, the pitfall here is that if you end up going to court or into some legal situation, that how can you prove it? What proof have you got? So you need to have people within your team who are able to deal with that and record that information. It happens not to be me. I'm not a good detailer. I'm a broad brush person in dealing with this. So moving on again, really very, very important in any investigation is that open thinking. We have a problem, again, another pitfall. If you go hurtling down the road, I've seen it before, I know what it is, I can come up with an answer right away. Well, maybe that's true, but you've really got to choose your time and you've really got to think that widely. I often joke, and I emphasise I'm joking, sometimes perhaps better go to the pub, have a couple of pints first to loosen up, to get your thinking right. So planning the investigation with open thinking, anything's possible. Don't even consider going to the analysis stage until you've got all the facts. So root cause analysis only comes after the planning. So many people talk about, oh yeah, we have to do a root cause analysis, but can't actually do one because they don't have the factual information. This picture here is one that I'm very fond of, not just because it was my granddaughter a very long time ago, but children have this amazing ability to ask questions. So those of you who are parents and have had small children will be well aware of the fact that they have an amazing ability to ask quite incisive questions, and sometimes often embarrassing questions, but nevertheless they are very, very good at that. Whereas we become well qualified, we're afraid to make fools of ourselves and such like. And that is a huge pitfall. I investigated in Far East Russia the dropping of a 240-ton load. Now, fortunately, it was by pure chance 2 people weren't killed, tipped the other way and avoided them. But the problem was, this had been a very well-planned job for a major international company and using some major international contractors. But when they did the risk assessment, all the engineers nodded it through. Yes, yes, that's fine, that's fine, that's fine. Now, the problem, in fact, was to do with centre of gravity. And the pitfall here was that everyone had accepted everyone else's expertise. And yet the 2 people who asked me, David, how could that fall over? One was a person out there, a man from New Zealand, and I said, Greg, what's your job? He said, I'm an accountant. And the other person was Gabrielle, who was my PA, who's an English graduate. They were able to ask the question because they didn't understand the problem. And we tend to accept we understand the problem. We're all qualified engineers, that's fine, we can deal with this. And yet, using children, their approach is very good. I believe this is a true story. Many years ago, the Dutch engineering company Hirema needed to drill a tunnel in Holland. And as we know, the Netherlands really is drilling through a wet sponge because a lot of it's below water level. And they actually did a very brave thing. They went along to a children's primary school and gave them jotters and posed a question with them, and they got the paper and they had coloured pens. And the kids came up with the answer. Now, I don't know what the answer was. It was something to do with worms. But nevertheless, they did this very brave thing that clearly the engineering company had to put dimensions on that. Moving on again, I'm very interested in weak signals and indicators. And often we miss these, and looking at a fatal accident in an explosives plant at one point, and rather than starting right at the point where the person had been killed, and of course when we're doing the investigation, all of the kind of nasty part that has been cleared up. We're not dealing with the immediate emergency, we're trying to find out what had gone wrong. So rather than going to the immediate point where the person had been killed, I circled around and looked at other things. And I was picking up weak signals which told me quite a lot. very interesting little point about a maintenance issue I came across, and a couple of other points like that. And very early on in the investigation, it was pointing to a management failure in that the senior managers and directors didn't really understand what was going on. We're all pretty familiar with barriers, and here we're looking at James Reason's Swiss cheese model. And it's certainly very, very important in that the companies that I'm sure are all listening to this all have very good systems with barriers and defences. And a number of us actually work with the tripod system, and they have 4 barrier types that we analysed for doing that. And from memory, they are missing barrier, inadequate barrier, failed barrier, and effective barrier. These are very useful because in looking for these, we should actually cover everything. And again, the major pitfall is if you discover that you don't have barriers, or barriers have been, or you haven't found actually which barriers have been bypassed or have failed. Again, I'm always very interested when we come to talk to people. I'm often asked the question, David, how do you know when somebody's lying? Well, the reality is I don't know when somebody's telling the truth, because we all tell our own truth. And we had a very interesting story where there was an incident with a helicopter with potential to be very high fatality risk. And fortunately, nothing happened. But the people who were with me at the time were all very experienced people. They were all offshore installation managers. They'd all flown in helicopters. They'd seen them. And an hour after we'd seen this event, I asked them what colour the helicopter was. And nobody knew. We had 10 different answers. So really an important point here is to don't assume that what the person tells you is right. They may believe it's right, usually do believe it's right, but you don't actually know until you've checked that out. And you'll see that I took a long time to learn how to interview. And one of the pitfalls is watching too much television, I think, American cop movies and such like, because interviewing is not like that. And the real way I find it best to get information from people is a relaxed conversation. Now, you might think, well, that's pretty difficult to do under serious circumstances. But in reality, that's what you seek to do. If you're not doing that, pitfalls come by talking through the interviewee, constantly seeking information from them, rather than letting them talk. So what you're seeking to do is to create a relaxed atmosphere where they will talk, and avoid things like loaded words. And even the favourite one to avoid is saying, we're not here to blame you, because what the person hears is blame. They don't hear the not bit, they only hear blame. And I don't even use the word interview now, because I think that's loaded. I'm just trying to get people to come and chat with me so we can solve the problem together. Interviewing is the big pitfall area I would suggest to it, and it's worth spending time looking at that and seeing how you can actually deal with that to get people to talk to. By structuring it correctly, then you can actually get people to tell you almost anything that's truthful. A thing to avoid as well, another huge pitfall, is some companies have a fact-finding interview, and essentially they've got a list of questions to be answered. Well, the person will in fact give you the answer you're looking for, rather than the one you actually need to have. So do avoid having those 20 questions. Were you wearing the correct PPE? Yes. Were you standing where you're supposed to be standing? Yes. That complete waste of time doing that. Don't even bother doing that at all. So it has to be a discussion for things to operate. Here we've got the human factors. What are the human factors? Why are they so important? Well, the reality, of course, is that people are involved at every stage of everything. So 2 major points to cover here very briefly. One is the investigation findings. When you were doing this, where were people involved? What were they doing? What was their contribution to the incident? It isn't necessarily about people deliberately doing things wrong. What errors, mistakes, violations, shortcuts that people take. Excuse me. You've got to try and establish exactly what those were. People are at the heart of everything. Do bear in mind that there's nothing in the known world, apart from an environment itself, trees, sea, sand and such like, that hasn't come out of somebody's head at some point. So people have to be involved. And I remember doing one major investigation for a railway company, and the head of the railway company wouldn't accept our findings because they were about people, they weren't about engineering. Well, clearly he was wrong, and the company went bust and he lost his job. And I don't have any great sympathy for him. Then we've got investigative performance. We've all got different psychological profiles, and we have to be very careful in what we're doing. I'm a big introvert and a judger, and that's not necessarily the best combination. You need to have a mixture of people in there. Judges just want to get the answer right away. I've seen it before, this is it, I'm sure I've got the answer now. So you need to have this ability to relate to other people. I was doing a major investigation with the team leader. I wasn't a team leader, I was a facilitator. And the team leader couldn't, in fact, relate to the rest of the team. He sat in his own office and worked away and hardly said good morning to anyone. Your job as a team leader is to go out and relate to people, to organise things, discuss how things are going, discuss with your client or your stakeholders. So really you have to be able to engage with people in what you're doing. And then clearly interviewing comes into this as well, and controlling the team. So, why the pills? Well, if we think of going along to the doctor, and you probably hear from my cough, so I'm probably needing to go to the doctor, is that we need to get from the symptom to the source. And of course, the danger is that we only get to the symptom of the problem. We don't really get to the root cause. So you'd be pretty upset if you went along to the doctor, and it does often happen, is that you get pills to deal with the symptom. I get something to stop me coughing, that's fine. But it doesn't actually solve the basic problem. Our job in doing the investigation is to get way beyond the symptom and to get to the source. I'm bringing root cause analysis in at this stage here because I very strongly feel that it's an area which we have to work very hard to get right. I'm amazed at the number of professional reports and well done and good reports that don't have a root cause analysis, because having the root cause analysis diagram does mean that you can actually see what has gone wrong. You should be able to trace that without any additional information at all. If it's properly written, you should be able to walk in and read that, and perhaps just with the support of some recommendations, the executive summary and photographs, you've got the whole story. And yet, so many reports that I read don't have either a root cause analysis at all or one that works well. Because remember, a root cause analysis is essentially a logic flow diagram telling you the story. And of course, in doing that, back to my earlier point, is that your root cause is going to be about people. It's got to come back to that. If you find that your root cause is somewhere in the engineering and technology area, then you haven't got to the root cause. Major pitfall with many investigations, and one of the problems for all of us who've got an engineering background, the solution is to weld the gate shut in a sense. But we've really got to get down to what was the people contribution in there. Even a design thing, who designed it, who thought about it, and it's got to come back to there at some point. This doesn't mean, and I don't like using the word blame, but it doesn't mean we're blaming something. We all make mistakes, we see things differently, we haven't discussed it properly. It's got to come back to people at some point. This is an interesting one here, the investigation findings. It's so easy to say, right, let's issue a draft report. Well, if I can possibly avoid it, I don't do a draft report first of all. I like to get all the stakeholders together so we can discuss what went wrong. And it means some days it can be quite argumentative, but it does mean that people go away having had a chance to contribute, they've understood the problem, the draft report hasn't sat in the drawer of somebody's office and have looked at it very late in the game, and then it's not right. I mean, I had one client once who said, I said, look, we'll have all the people there at 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon. He said, we don't do that in this company. I said, oh, you do now. And he said afterwards, gosh, David, he said, we would never do it any other way. It gave us a chance to talk about it. Very quick list here, just some of the things that I've found. It's maybe not about the pitfalls of the investigation, but if you just scan down that, you'll see many of the things that where we've found things have gone wrong. So it does give you a kind of heads up of where you want to go in doing that. And I suspect all of you listening to this have come up to probably a pretty similar list of events. Briefly, just talking about software here. In that software is fantastic. It's very, very helpful. It's great, whatever software you're using, whether it's a system like the one that we have or anyone else's system. But the danger is that the person on the keyboard is king or queen. What you have to do is do all your investigation with computer support, but not on the computer. You have to discuss things with people. You have to share, because if you don't do that, then we're in the danger of garbage in, garbage out with the computer. So it's a useful tool as a pen it might be. And then we go on, and this is a big one. I was in America last week. We actually ran a course on report writing, how to write reports. Many reports, they're detailed and jargon's far, far too great. And the trick is to write in an understandable way and think of a mid-range newspaper, because if a person can't read it or understand it, there's no point in doing the report. So mid-range newspapers are always a very good guide for that. There are one or two very good reports that I would recommend you look at, and you can get the things online. In America, it would be the Chemical Safety Board. They do a very good report. A couple of British ones, the Marine Accident Investigation Branch, and then also Air Accident Investigation Branch. There is a world standard for air accident investigations, and they tend to work on the same sort of model. And I know that in doing the air crash course, there was a specific part on report writing. And reports don't need to be long. I did an investigation on a fire on board a ship sometime over the last year. Very difficult to find out what went wrong, and I had to get a forensic fire specialist to work with me. So we did it. We found out what had actually gone wrong, or seemed to have gone wrong. I sent it back to the client, and the client said, "That's very good, thank you for the draft report." I said, "That wasn't the draft report, that's it." I said, "There's nothing else I can tell you. We could write more, but there's no point. There's no more information to give you. And by the way, here's the invoice." So very important, just write what you need to write. Avoid padding at all costs. Getting just towards the end of my presentation or webinar this morning is the importance of staying independent. Relatively easy for me and for my team, but quite often there's a pressure for you within a company to conform with somebody else's view and somebody else's thought. And we have been asked to change our reports and to do things in a different way to suit the client's particular requirements. Well, we can force a position that we can walk away from, so we don't do that. But there is often a pressure to conform with what the company's expectation would be, that, well, it didn't happen that way, or we don't do things like that here. But the reality is, this whole independence, if you don't remain independent, you devalue everything you've done and everything you'll do in the future. Not easy at times, but extremely important. And really, my almost last slide here is to talk about legal issues. And I can't tell you what the legal issues are in your particular situation. But for me, it is one of the big pitfalls. We can start an investigation and discover in starting that we're not actually working for the company as we thought we were. It's been handed over to some legal department, either the legal department within the company or with external legal advisors. And you really can get into quite a lot of difficulty here about what's privileged and confidential, what you can use. And we once got into a very difficult situation with an organisation in South Africa about this, that we started out doing an investigation of a really, really bad incident. People have been killed, and we established that the company had done some pretty bad things, loss of control, and they really were culpable. There was no question of that in this particular exercise. But partway through the investigation, they've handed the things over to the lawyers. So suddenly, rather than dealing with the company itself, we were dealing with lawyers. And the company was really building a castle for themselves. They're putting the defences up to prevent us releasing what we'd actually found. Real difficulty. So please, when you're doing something, check what your legal position are, your legal requirements, who you're actually responding to, because for me, that can be a major pitfall and get you into really hot water. Well, ladies and gentlemen who are listening, thanks very much, because I've essentially covered some of the pitfalls as I see them based on the experience that I've had over quite a number of years. And I know that in talking to my other team of investigators, some of whom I think are listening this morning, I think they would broadly agree with everything I'm saying. Clearly there are further pitfalls, but we can't quite cover all of those in 40 minutes. But very happy if anybody wants to email me or contact me through Trish to give further information. Okay, thanks very much. Can I pass this back to you, Trish?
Okay, thanks for that, David. That's I think that was really useful. We've actually got a couple of questions that have come through so far. So, and I've actually got one as well. So I might first of all ask one of the two questions that's been asked by one of our audience. Could you provide any more detail on the reference for a course on report writing? So there's obviously some people online that are interested in understanding how to write incident reports more concisely.
That's a really interesting one. Do you know, in our website, it's the one area of inquiry more than any other is about report writing. But it's a very tricky one. I think that, well, let me say that the first thing I had to say to the people last week, I can't teach you to write. That was your job of your teacher at school. But what I can do is to teach you how to structure a report. Now, each company may have a style which has to be reported to. If they don't have that, then I suggest you look around for one that suits well. The job of the person writing the report is to communicate and essentially to tell a story. And if you keep the point of telling a story to the front of your head, that is what you're seeking to do, is to tell the story of what happened. Now, however you put that out, I'm back to this, looking at a kind of mid-range newspaper, it's very useful. A very good style guide, in fact, that you might find this strange because it comes across as a heavyweight business paper, which it really isn't, is the newspaper The Economist. Have a look at The Economist, and it is written extremely well. Other areas to look at are deciding how you lay your report out with photographs and diagrams and such like. So, for example, if you're to take an air accident investigation report, it covers everything, even things that don't happen. So, for example, it might say, I can't remember the coding system now, it might say, at 1.24, fire, there was no fire, or 2.83, survivability, this was not a survivable crash. So tell people what has and hasn't happened. The other one I quite like was the Rail Accident Investigation Branch back here in the UK, and you can get this online if you just Google it. And they number the reports, the numbers out of the paragraphs. Every paragraph has got a separate number, of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, which I find better than a kind of academic type report. But clearly the layout of having just an executive summary, telling people what went wrong, recommendations, and I very, very strongly believe in having a root cause diagram which logically shows what happens. If you can read that, essentially you probably don't need the whole report. Avoid padding at all costs, ensure that all abbreviations and mnemonics are actually in the appendix. So, bear in mind you're writing a story for somebody to understand. I hope that's helpful.
Okay, thanks for that, David. So to anybody else on the line, if you do have any questions, you can actually type your questions in the question panel and they will pop up and I'll then ask them to David. We have another one here. Interested to get some elaboration on variations in different parts of the world. E.g., you mentioned some differences between Europe and the USA. So do you see any particular differences in practical sense around what you're doing in different parts of the world?
Not really, actually, fact. I mean, my team, we've investigated, in many, many countries around the world. So in terms of doing the actual report, I don't find too much difference of doing the actual investigation. I think some of the problems really come with dealing with people, in the sense that the cultural thing, in certain cultures, people want to tell you what they think you want to hear. Yes, Mr. David, and they'll tell you whatever. So I suppose that's a bit of an issue there, rather than maybe the Aussies, Trish, will tell it how it is. It's pretty straight. The Scots are a bit like that as well. Sometimes it's difficult, maybe to cut to the chase. I think that's a problem. I think the other problem is if you're having to interview someone who you don't speak the language, and then you have to do it through a translator. And I am emphasising the word translator, not interpreter. You can ask the question, and you ask it through the interpreter or translator, and you hear the person speaking in their language, sentence after sentence after sentence, and then the interpreter said, he said yes. So there's that problem there. But in terms of actually, if you've structured your approach, whichever country you're in, it should, in fact, if you've got a good investigation approach, it should actually work. I'm just running through my mind at the moment all the different countries I've personally worked in. I don't see a big difference apart from in talking to the people. Certainly, you've got to look at how you manage your team, and a big area in that for me is the ability to stick on time, to turn up, to do the job, to do what you're asked to do. And interviewing is always difficult at any point. So really concentrate, on the interviewing. I think that's as much as I want to say.
Okay, just on that interviewing then, I might ask a question. So you said that you don't assume that what someone tells you is basically accurate. So how do you wade through all that different information and potentially conflicting information to actually get to what is the truth?
I think that's a very difficult one to get a definitive answer. I'm going to step away from incident investigation as such. I've done a lot of management consultancy over the years. And you go along, you start talking to the directors of the company, it all seems very plausible and such like, oh gosh, that's right. It's only when you dig down through all the other people you talk to within the organisation does a picture start to emerge. And it's certainly true in terms of doing investigation. If you talk to just one person, then that's really not satisfactory, because they will tell you what they absolutely believe to be true. So, for example, one I could think of where there's only one witness to this fatality. But we had to put that out by looking at all the other failures in the systems. It had to be supported by physical facts and as far as we could find them. And equally, people do have different views. I remember one where we interviewed 9 people in a railway incident. Now, these 9 people were the potential victims. There were 9 of them who were likely to be killed in this particular situation. So they had absolutely nothing to hide, nor was they trying to hide anything. But we got, maybe not 9 different reports or 9 different views, but they certainly were very different in what they said. So I think it's very difficult to get that. So you've got to look for as much proof as possible. And I think if you put your hand on your heart in any investigation, at the end of it you say, have I got all the facts? Did I get everything? I think that's a very difficult one. But talking to people is, you have to structure it so you can get people to tell you as honestly they believe they're telling you whatever the story happens to be.
Okay. So following on from that, we've got a question in here now that says, are witness statements any use, or is interviewing better?
I'm glad you brought that up. I hate witness statements. Absolutely. So I'm glad somebody brought that up, because it's in the back of my head. I thought I must mention witness statements. I think a number of reasons why I don't like witness statements. The first one is very often the person you're asking to write the witness statements may not in fact be all that good at writing with a pen or whatever. It's a difficult skill for them, and so they're concentrating trying to get that right. They may collaborate with other people and such. Now, on the other hand, if something happens you can't get there, if they just write the headings down, that would be very, very useful indeed. If you're a skilled interviewer, you'll get much more information, in my view. I'm not fond of witness statements. One of my colleagues did an investigation down in Brazil, and it was an explosives plant. And he said, could I see the witness statements? And it was, were you standing where you're supposed to be standing? Yes. Were you following the correct procedures? Yes, and so on. So Jackie just tore up the sheet. I said, what do you mean? Let me take you along. So we went along to where the explosion had been, and one of the things the person said they'd been standing in the correct position. And of course, where the person was standing was a great hole in the ground, and the wall had disappeared. And so they had given the answer that, yeah, tick the box, signed it Pablo or Jose or whatever. So I really think the skilled interviewer is the best way of doing it, but clearly at times you have to work with witness statements. One final thing I want to say, please don't record witness interviews. You turn it into a police interview. Really just try to have a note taker, capturing a summary of the headlines of things to do. You can go back across it with people afterwards. It lets you interview the person without interrupting, trying to write notes, but don't use a tape recorder if you possibly can avoid that.
Okay. Thanks for that. That's an interesting point, because I think sometimes we do think, oh, that might be the easiest way, but there's obviously some nuances that get lost in that. We've got another question. Sorry?
I just wanted that. When I'm speaking at 180 words a minute. So if you multiply that by a 20-minute interview or a half-hour interview, it's a lot of words to go through if you've done 10 or 20 interviews. So it's not all that useful. So back to your question.
Got another question here. Do you have a specific investigation method that you follow and gives you the structure? I assume it's very difficult to get the right or useful information from the documents, interviews and facility procedures, etc. in terms of what's evidence.
Well, I think this is the point where we play the advert, that essentially, we have our own system. I devised the system we've got, TOPSET, many years ago, and that's the model that we worked on it. Some of my team have worked on it extensively, but we have a very clear structure for working through the whole process, and that's very effective, and that's why we did the Macondo investigation, that worked very well for us. But there are other systems, and some of my team are trained to use the tripod analysis method. But you've clearly got to have a structure. And sadly, a lot of the police forces, maybe they're changing now, a lot of police forces don't have a clear structure. And we've had police come to us and say, look, David, could we have some of your materials? Because we don't have anything as structured as that. In fact, one of my very good investigators was a very senior police officer in a particular part of the world, and he said, David, I would even pay to come in an investigation with you. And I would pay, I don't want someone to be killed, but I would almost pay to go and do a murder investigation, just to compare systems. So it's very important to have a structure to follow.
Okay. In terms of the competency of the team, how do you know which skills you're going to need?
Yeah, well, I think that's fairly straightforward. I mean, I think a lot of people I'm talking to just now will be chemical engineers, of a chemical engineering background. I'm a food technologist originally. So you need to have an understanding of that. There's a very interesting point in here. We've done quite a lot of railway stuff in the past, and I'm not a railway expert. And it's easy to assume that everyone else in the room is an expert. I remember doing stuff for London Underground, and there was a problem with something called a switch rail. And I drew it up on the wall, and London Underground's expert on railway layout was there, and he said, David, you haven't got that quite right. And I didn't look at what he was doing, he was drawing. I looked at the other railway experts in the room, and they didn't understand either. So the danger is that the assumption that people actually know everything about everything, and it's not the case. So it's difficult selecting the right person, but you've got to get a mixture of people who've got the competence. I do a lot of work in explosives. I'm not an explosives expert, obviously I know a lot about it now, so I have to have the technical expert there. I have to have a person there who's good at detailing, which I'm not good at doing. You've got to have somebody who's good at interviewing. I happen to be quite good at that, and so on. So it depends on the size and severity of the investigation, how many people you need there.
Okay, good. In terms of, you mentioned the independence is critically important, and that at times the organisation will inadvertently, or even at times perhaps deliberately, try and influence that that independence or the findings, and that would result in them applying pressure in some way. Do you have any standard tips for people that are facing that situation where they are essentially being confronted with an ethical dilemma of being pressured to do something that they don't actually believe they've got the evidence for that finding or such?
I think you've just got to be tough and say that. Oddly enough, I came across that last week, and the person was saying to within the company wanted to remove a few pages from the report. I said, well, if you do that, you take my name off the front. So it's a pretty difficult one. It's very easy for us as an external organisation to say we're not doing that. That was the problem with this South African one we had. They didn't want to know the truth. They wanted a coloured version of the truth. We just can't be there. So it's a tough one, and it's difficult for people to do. I know that my daughter sent me an email last week. She works in the prison service, and she said that she had to be a whistleblower. She said it was very uncomfortable to do that, but she said if she didn't do that, then she could lose her license as a social work person, and of course bad things could happen. So I think it's a moral dilemma, and it's difficult for people to do, but you have to do it.
Yeah, I know from my own experience, I was faced at one stage with an investigation where I had done the investigation and I had found issues with the systems and processes that were being used. And a manager 2 levels above me rejected the report because he wanted it clearly to say that someone should be fired.
Yeah. No, you
and as a manager, once removed from my position, that was also then very challenging to deal with because I was not willing to change the findings from the report, which I believed were accurate, and felt that it would have been unjust had that person been punished with dismissal.
Sure. No, it really is. It's a real moral dilemma. I think we all face these things in our lives, and it's being tough enough to stand up to that. Not easy.
Absolutely. That's all the questions we have at the moment. So what I might do is I'll just take back control to just close out the webinar now. So thanks very much for that, David. I think that was actually quite informative, and certainly I've done a lot of investigations myself over the years in various different roles, so I could certainly relate to some of the pitfalls that you were talking about. Some of them I know that I have personally fallen into. What I wanted to just very briefly run through with the audience now is just some of the things that the Safety Centre has been up to lately. So we now have 4 different case studies released, and in fact the 4th one that we released earlier this year is called Offshore Platform, and it does have an incident investigation focus on it. So if you are interested in knowing more about those, all of you on the line as Safety Centre members means that your companies do have access to this material. So please contact us and let us know if you have any questions about those. In terms of some of the other activities that we've been doing, earlier this year, we published a couple of chapters into the OHS body of knowledge, which was really designed to try and highlight for people a basic understanding of process safety. It's particularly targeted at those that work as occupational health and safety professionals, but it is actually quite helpful for a number of different people, including, for example, new graduate engineers or people within an organisation that are starting to become a bit more aware of process safety. There's some good information there. And they're available as a free download from that URL of ohsbok.org.au. Lastly, just some of the work that we're doing at the moment. We're doing some more work in competency in terms of how to actually achieve competency in the range of different topics that we published in our first guidance documents back in 2015. We're also doing some work on developing toolkits to implement the process safety metrics that we also published back in 2015. This is to help with the consistent application. We've got a project happening with undergraduate education where we're looking at developing some resources to assist universities in teaching process safety within their engineering undergraduate degrees. And lastly, we have a project on process safety in the 21st century and beyond. We're actually launching this think piece that we've been working in collaboration with the Mary Karakana Process Safety Centre in for about the last 18 months. We're launching that on the 1st of October at the World Congress of Chemical Engineering in Barcelona, and we will then be publishing that out very broadly and seeking further input and comments from people on that particular document as to what the challenges are of today and how we may overcome them to improve process safety for the future. If you have any further questions that you'd like to ask, or if you'd like to send through anything that you'd like me to pass on to David at Kelvin TOPSET, then please contact us at the Safety Centre. There's a couple of different ways. You can also follow us on Twitter or check out our LinkedIn page. The last thing I wanted to mention is that we're also doing another series of webinars. We're actually doing these on behalf of IChemE itself, so these are actually courses that you would pay to attend, or webinars you'd pay to attend. We have 6 different webinars occurring over November and December, and we'll be discussing in each of those, each of the 6 pillars of process safety, so knowledge and competence, engineering and design, etc. They'll be being hosted by myself and Susanna Gines, who works for me as a deputy in the IChemE Safety Centre. It looks as though we've just got one more further question come in. No, it's just someone's actually thanked us very much, David. They really enjoyed the webinar, and I can certainly echo that. I found it very interesting, so thank you very much, David, for your time and contribution that you put into this ISC member webinar. As a member of the ISC, we certainly value Kelvin TOPSET's contribution and very much your contribution in doing this webinar. So thank you very much.
My pleasure, thank you.
And with that, we will close out the webinar. Have a safe evening or day wherever you might be in the world. Take care. Bye.
Bye.